Industrial food items were integrated into daily consumption as standard goods. They became a normal, unquestioned part of the weekly routine. Their long-term impact on health and culture was not immediately apparent. This was not an isolated event, but a quiet template for replacement. Not in a single decision, not with a press release or a public debate. The shift happened across decades in kitchens and grocery stores, through advertising and convenience, until what had been passed down for generations was gently set aside and replaced with something engineered for shelf life and profit margin. For most of human history, food preparation was knowledge. It was transmitted person to person, mother to daughter, father to son, neighbor to neighbor. The methods were regional, seasonal, imperfect. They required time and attention. They weren't uniform. A loaf of bread in one household didn't taste like the bread 3 doors down. Cheese aged differently depending on the room it sat in. Preservation methods, fermentation, drying, salting, were adapted to climate and circumstance. There was no central authority dictating how food should be made, because food wasn't a product, it was a practice. That practice required more than recipes. It required rhythm. It required noticing when dough had risen enough, when milk had soured just right for cultured butter, when vegetables were at the edge of spoiling and needed to be pickled or canned. It required living with food as a process, not as a finished item removed from a package. This wasn't romanticized at the time, it was simply how things were done. People didn't call it traditional because there was no alternative framework to contrast it against. It was ordinary life. The replacement didn't announce itself as a replacement. It arrived as an improvement, as progress, as liberation from labor and inefficiency. And in many ways it was. The ability to preserve food for months without spoilage, to standardize flavor and texture, to reduce the hours spent preparing meals, these were genuine advancements. But what wasn't discussed, what wasn't even visible at the time, was what else was being replaced along with the labor. Because tradition isn't just a method, it's also a form of knowledge transfer, a pacing mechanism, a connection to seasonality and region. When you remove the practice, you don't just save time, you sever the transmission line. The next generation doesn't learn by watching and adjusting. They learn by reading instructions on a box, if they learn at all. By the mid-20th century, industrial food production had become sophisticated enough to replicate, or appear to replicate, almost anything that had previously required skill or time. Bread that once needed kneading, rising, attention to temperature, could now be purchased pre-sliced in a plastic bag with a shelf life of weeks. Cheese that once required culturing and aging could be produced in uniform blocks, shipped across the country, stored indefinitely. Fermented vegetables, which had been a cornerstone of preservation in cold climates, were replaced by canned and later frozen versions that required no microbial management, no waiting, no risk of failure. The marketing was careful. It didn't say, "Abandon your grandmother's methods." It said, "Make her life easier." It said, "Spend more time with your family." It said, "This tastes just as good, and it's safer." Most people didn't question it. Why would they? The products worked. They were convenient. They were affordable. They were endorsed by scientists, by government agencies, by doctors. The implication was clear. If you were still doing things the old way, you were being inefficient. You were wasting time. You were clinging to outdated practices when modern solutions were readily available. And so, gradually, the practices stopped being passed down. Not all at once, not universally, but enough that within 2 generations, vast portions of the population had no direct experience with food as anything other than a purchased product. The knowledge didn't disappear entirely. It persisted in pockets, in certain communities, in families that resisted the shift for cultural or economic reasons, but it ceased to be the default. It became niche, quaint, something people did as a hobby, not as a necessity. This wasn't discussed openly. There was no public conversation about what it meant to replace lived knowledge with purchased convenience. There was no assessment of what might be lost when food production moved from the home and the small-scale producer to the factory and the supermarket. The assumption was that anything homemade could be replicated industrially, and that replication was always an improvement. But replication isn't the same as equivalence. When you ferment vegetables at home, you're working with wild bacteria, with ambient temperature, with time. The result is variable. It's alive. It continues changing even after you jar it. Industrial pickling, by contrast, uses vinegar and pasteurization to create a stable, shelf-safe product. It's consistent. It's predictable. It's also fundamentally different. The microbial complexity is gone. The live cultures are dead. What you gain in convenience and safety, you lose in biological activity. The same logic applied across the board. Sourdough starters, maintained for years and passed between families, were replaced by commercial yeast packets. Bone broths that simmered for days were replaced by bouillon cubes and canned stocks. Cultured dairy products were replaced by pasteurized, homogenized versions with extended shelf life and none of the active bacterial content. Each replacement was presented as neutral, a simple swap, same outcome, less effort. But the outcome wasn't the same. Not in nutritional content, not in microbial diversity, not in the knowledge required to produce it, and certainly not in the relationship people had with food. When food is something you make, you understand it differently. You know what's in it because you put it there. You know how it behaves because you've watched it rise, curdle, ferment, spoil. You develop an intuition for it. You can tell when something's off, when it needs more time, when it's ready. That intuition doesn't come from reading. It comes from repetition, from failure, from adjustment. When food is something you buy, that relationship changes. You trust the label. You trust the brand. You assume the factory did it correctly because you have no reference point to judge otherwise. If something tastes different from batch to batch, you assume it's a mistake, not a natural variation. If something spoils quickly, you assume it was defective, not that it was made without preservatives. The loss wasn't immediate. For a generation, maybe two, people still remembered the old methods. They could recall a grandmother's bread, a grandfather's pickles, a neighbor's cheese. They might not have known how to make those things themselves, but they remembered that they existed, that they were different, that there had been another way. But memory fades, and once the people who held that memory were gone, so was the reference point. By the late 20th century, most people in industrialized nations had never tasted genuinely fermented food. They had never seen milk separate into curds and whey. They had never smelled the particular sharpness of a sourdough starter at peak activity. They had no framework for understanding what had been replaced because they had never experienced the original. And so, the replacement became invisible. It wasn't that people didn't care about food. They did. They cared about flavor, about health, about variety, but their understanding of what food could be had been shaped entirely by industrial production. When they thought of bread, they thought of the grocery store. When they thought of cheese, they thought of plastic-wrapped blocks. When they thought of vegetables, they thought of the produce aisle or the freezer section. The idea that food could be something you cultivated, something you maintained, something that required ongoing attention and knowledge, that idea had been quietly removed from the cultural vocabulary. This had consequences. Not immediately, not in ways that were easy to measure, but over time, patterns began to emerge. People reported that food didn't taste the way they remembered, that bread seemed blander, that tomatoes seemed watery, that nothing had the depth of flavor their grandparents described. This was often dismissed as nostalgia, as selective memory, as the inevitable distortion of time. But it wasn't just memory. Industrial optimization had genuinely changed the food. Tomatoes were bred for uniform ripening and durability during shipping, not for flavor. Bread was formulated for extended shelf life, not for complexity of taste. Cheese was standardized for meltability and consistency, not for the depth that comes from aging and microbial variation. The food had changed, but because the change had been gradual, because it had been framed as progress, most people didn't register it as a loss. They just accepted that this was what food tasted like now. There were other shifts, harder to pin down but no less significant. People seemed less confident in their ability to judge food quality. They relied more heavily on expiration dates than on their own senses. They threw out food that looked or smelled slightly off, even if it was perfectly safe, because they had no experience with natural variation. They didn't trust their instincts because those instincts had never been developed. At the same time, there was a growing sense of disconnection. Food had become something external, something produced elsewhere by people you'd never meet, using methods you didn't understand. It arrived in packaging designed to obscure its origins. There were no dirt-covered carrots, no irregular shapes, no signs of the farm or the season or the hands that had grown it. Just clean, uniform products optimized for shelf appeal. This wasn't an accident. Industrial food production required scale, and scale required standardization. You couldn't ship irregular vegetables across the country. They wouldn't stack efficiently. They'd bruise. They'd arrive looking unappealing. You couldn't produce artisanal cheese in factories. It took too long. The results were too variable. The profit margins were too thin. You couldn't maintain regional food traditions in a national marketplace. Consumers expected the same product in every store, in every city, all year round. So the system optimized for what it could control: uniformity, shelf life, cost efficiency, visual appeal. And in doing so, it optimized away everything else: the seasonality, the regionality, the microbial complexity, the knowledge base, the human relationship with food as a living, changing process. None of this was hidden. The changes were visible, documented, widely implemented, but they weren't framed as a trade-off. They were framed as pure gain: more food, cheaper food, safer food, more convenient food. The assumption was that these improvements came without cost. But there was a cost. It just wasn't measured in the metrics the system cared about. You couldn't quantify the loss of knowledge in a quarterly earnings report. You couldn't measure the erosion of food culture in a nutrition label. You couldn't track the growing dependence on industrial production in a supply chain optimization model. So those losses didn't register. They weren't considered. They simply happened, quietly, as a side effect of decisions made for entirely different reasons. And once the transition was complete, once the infrastructure was in place and the population had adapted, reversal became difficult. Because the knowledge was gone. The small-scale producers had largely disappeared, the supply chains had been reconfigured, the consumer expectations had shifted. Even if someone wanted to return to traditional methods, they often didn't know how. The tools weren't readily available. The ingredients weren't the same. The time required felt unrealistic in a modern context. What had once been ordinary, making your own bread, culturing your own dairy, fermenting your own vegetables, was now specialized knowledge, something you had to actively seek out, study, practice, something that required going against the grain of a system designed for convenience and speed. Most people didn't have the time, the space, the resources, or the knowledge base to make that shift. So they didn't. They continued buying the products they'd always bought, accepting them as the baseline, as normal, as the way food simply was. And the gap between what food had been and what it had become continued to widen. By the turn of the 21st century, there were entire populations who had never experienced food outside the industrial model. They had never tasted raw milk. They had never eaten bread made with wild yeast. They had never consumed vegetables fermented with naturally occurring bacteria. They didn't know those things existed, or if they did, they understood them as fringe practices, niche hobbies, things done by people with too much time or too much concern for purity. The industrial model had become so dominant, so normalized, so deeply embedded in infrastructure and culture that it was nearly invisible. People didn't think about where their food came from or how it was made because the system didn't require them to. It required only that they purchase, consume, and repeat. But systems built for efficiency and scale aren't necessarily built for resilience or longevity. And what happens when a population loses the ability to feed itself outside of that system, when the knowledge, the infrastructure, the practices that sustained humans for millennia are replaced by products that require factories, supply chains, and corporate continuity to exist, becomes a different kind of question. One that wasn't asked at the time. One that still isn't asked often enough. Because the transition didn't feel like a loss. It felt like progress. It felt like liberation. It felt like the modern world arriving, as it always does, with promises of improvement and efficiency. And by the time the costs became visible, the alternative had already disappeared. Similar patterns followed in other areas of daily life. Not just in food,